right now. Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for the USA Today. Sir Michael Singleton is a Republican political consultant. Omarosa Manigault Newman is, of course, former White House staffer and author of Unhinged, a huge bestseller, an insider's account of the Trump White House. By the way, congratulations, because you've turned out to be the first whistleblower. You were ahead of Bob Woodward, ahead of this person. By the way, who do you think wrote the op-ed?
I think it's somebody out of Pence's office, and I suspect it might be Nick Ayers.
Why? Why would somebody write an op-ed piece? Do they want the 25th Amendment to take effect and put Pence in office? What?
They're in the position to benefit if, in fact, the 25th Amendment is enacted and if Trump is removed from office. The clues are in the op-ed.
And which are?
When it says,
use the word
when
Lodestar?
and if he leaves, however, indicating whether it's by impeachment or by the investigation or if he's not reelected.
So you don't believe that the vice president, when he denies responsibility for this?
I actually believe the vice president when he denies it, but the style of the writing reminds me of memos and documents and emails that came out of the vice president's office.
But you still think it's one of his staffers?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Susan, you talked about that. I just want to get to something really big because you've got so much influence. You write the top of the fold, USA Today, the one newspaper read all over the country, and you have an analysis piece in Today, which basically says this president has got a real reckoning coming to him right now.
I think there is a sense of storm gathering. You know, just in the past week, the McCain funeral, the op-ed in the New York Times, and the Woodward book together paint a very consistent picture for the president and lays the groundwork for what I think is the big event to come, which is the Mueller report and what Robert Mueller finds.
Do you have any timing sense on that yet?
I don't. I mean, we've all believed that he would try not to interfere in the midterm election, which means that report either relatively soon or months away. Or
a day after the election. Sure, Michael, what do you make of the president accusing the New York Times and the writer of this article, the New York Times, of being a traitor? A traitor to the country.
Well, he said it was treason.
What does that mean?
And I don't think the president knows the definition of treason, to be quite honest with you, because if he does, I would ask the president, where is the treasonous act? Where did the treasonous act occur? But what I do think is very telling about this is that it's very obvious that whatever is going on internally within the administration is all because of Donald Trump. He's the leader. He has set the tone. Yeah. And it's very telling that those individuals who he selected to work with him on behalf of him and the people who voted for him don't trust the president. But I do think those individuals need to have enough courage to come out and say who they are, because not saying who they are.
But you know what? We don't have to vote for them. Sure, Mike. I'm worried about the president. I want to get back to the president here. And I want to, Omarosa, I want to ask you about this. The fact that the president thinks upon a person who doesn't like him as a traitor to the country, how's that mentality develop? What's that mean to say about Trump?
He's already had this extreme level of paranoia. And I'm telling you,
he thinks he's the state.
He does. You know what? This is triggering all of his worst fears, and it's going to make him go around and hunt down this person in the White House, in the agencies, and it's not a good precedent.
Do you think he's up to that, Susan? Do you think there's a manhunt or a woman hunt or whatever? Is Trump out there looking for the guy that ate this frozen strawberries and Ukraine mutiny?
Yes, I think the president is pretty determined to try to find out who the author is. That doesn't mean he'll be able to. Because, for one thing, I don't think you can necessarily believe that just because someone denied they were the author, that they were not, in fact, the author. And if you think it's possible, we'll find out pretty soon. But you think about back to Deep Throat, it took a couple decades before we were certain who Deep Throat was. Although
and then it turned out to be a pretty boring guy. You know, it wasn't somebody as exciting as a White House staffer.
But this was very much like Primary Colors. When I served in the Clinton administration, there was something very similar to this. They were trying to figure out who wrote Primary Colors, and they found out by doing a writing analysis. So
Joe
I think
Klein.
He
told me he didn't write it. I caught him up in New Hampshire, but he told everybody he didn't write. Then he wrote anyway. It appears that behind the closed doors of the West Wing itself, the president's unable to distinguish friend from foe right now. According to the Washington Post, White House officials are not only disavowing the op-ed, they're attempting to prove their loyalty to the president. Catch this. In Oval Office huddles yesterday, actually Thursday, White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, National Security Advisor John Bolton, Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and Senior Advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner, among other aides, tried to convince the president that he could trust them and others in his inner circle. They argued that the author was probably a lower-level employee, according to a senior official. You're laughing over there, but I want to go back to you. Big-time journalists like you, are you out there trying to figure out who this person is? And you say the president's trying to find out who it is. Are you guys trying? By the way, New York Times reporters, these tough guys like Michael Schmidt and the rest of them,
are they trying to find out?
out?
I assume they are.
Keep going.
I think, I think we would like to know who it is. And I think one other thing, I think it is a brilliant move by this White House that we are worrying about who it is and not what this person said.
But I thought they're trying to change the subject. They don't like it. Sure, Michael, they say the president, somebody put out a statement yesterday saying, don't think about who did it. I guess it was Huckabee Sanders did that.
You know, look, I do think, to Susan's point, it's far more important what's actually written in that article. And there's a line in there where the individual writes that they're trying to help the country, if you will, by making sure the president doesn't commit disastrous acts. Well, I wonder, and I would argue, that what we've seen so far has been pretty disastrous. So if there are other things that are worse than this, what does that mean?
Former President Barack Obama says, what good are you guys in the White House defending us against 10% of this crap when 90% of it's happening thanks to you guys? In his first campaign remarks of 2018, former President Barack Obama today warned voters not to take comfort in the sentiments expressed in that Times op-ed. Here he goes.
The claim that everything will turn out okay because there are people inside the White House who secretly aren't following the president's orders. That is not a check. I'm being serious here. That's not how our democracy is supposed to work. These people aren't elected. They're not accountable. They're not doing us a service by actively promoting 90% of the crazy stuff that's coming out of this White House and then saying, don't worry, we're preventing the other 10%.
Now, Marissa, is that true that the people in the White House feel morally superior because they're keeping Trump from doing a tenth of the damage worse than he is doing?
Well, the former president threw out 10%. I would have to venture and say that there was more. Just in the time that I served.
There's more damage control.
Absolutely. In the time that I served, he would have these dangerous impulses. And the op-ed said his most dangerous impulses, they're not just ignoring any order that the president's giving, but when he says, let's blow up this country because he doesn't like something that the leader of that country said, then of course the staffers are going to push back, and they should.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.